You think you understand betrayal. You felt that cold knife twist in your stomach when someone you trusted turned against you. But let me tell you something that will make your modern heartbreak seem like a gentle caress. In feudal Japan, betrayal wasn't just personal, it was an art form painted in blood, and the canvas was human flesh. Tonight, while you scroll through your phone, safe in your comfortable ignorance, I'm going to show you what it really meant to be branded a traitor in a land where honor was sharper than any blade. And when I'm done, you'll never look at loyalty the same way again. Because deep down in that primitive corner of your brain that still remembers ancient fears, you'll recognize the same capacity for betrayal that lives inside you right now. Picture this. It's 1467, and the Onin War has just begun. Japan is tearing itself apart. And in this chaos, every samurai faces a choice that will define not just their death, but how their family will remember them for generations. The air smells of cherry blossoms and burning villages, a contradiction that would make you laugh if you weren't busy trying to survive. But here's what your history books never told you. Betrayal in feudal Japan wasn't a moment of weakness. It was a calculated dance with death, where every step was choreographed by centuries of ritual, honor, and the most creative forms of human suffering ever devised. The Japanese didn't just kill traitors, they erased them from existence in ways that would make your worst nightmares seem like bedtime stories. You see, the concept of loyalty, giri, wasn't just a social expectation. It was a living, breathing entity that demanded blood sacrifice. When you swore fealty to your daimyo, you weren't just promising to serve. You were signing a contract written in your own potential agony, agreeing that if you ever broke that bond, your death would serve as entertainment for others. Let me introduce you to someone who learned this lesson the hard way. Akechi Mitsuhide, the man who betrayed Oda Nobunaga in 1582. You might think you know this story, the ambitious retainer who turned against his lord at Honnoji Temple. But what you don't know is what happened to traitors who weren't lucky enough to die quickly in battle. Mitsuhide was fortunate. He died fighting, sword in hand, before the real punishment could begin. Others weren't so blessed. When a samurai was caught alive after betraying his lord, the process of dying began long before the final breath left their body. The Japanese had perfected the art of extended death, not just physical, but spiritual annihilation that reached backward through time to stain every ancestor, and forward to curse every descendant. The first stage of a traitor's death was isolation. They were stripped of their name, their family crest, their very identity. In a culture where your name was your soul, this was like being flayed alive from the inside out. Imagine waking up one morning and discovering that every photo of you had been erased, every record of your existence deleted, every person you'd ever known forbidden to speak your name. That's what happened to traitors. They became unpersons, ghosts walking among the living. But the psychological torture was just the appetizer. The main course was something called death by 1,000 cuts. Though the Japanese had their own variations that would make Chinese lingshi seem merciful, the key wasn't just to cause pain. Any amateur could do that. The art was in calibrating the suffering to match the magnitude of the betrayal, creating a symphony of agony that would resonate through generations. They would start with the fingers, not cutting them off. That would be too quick, too kind. Instead, they would slowly peel away the nail, then the skin, then work their way down to the bone, all while keeping the traitor conscious and aware. The smell of blood and fear would fill the air, mixing with the incense that was always burning in Japanese courtyards, creating a scent that witnesses would carry with them for the rest of their lives. Here's what really happened to betrayers. They were forced to watch their own dismantling. Mirrors were positioned so they could see every cut, every drop of blood, every moment of their own destruction. The psychological impact was devastating, not just for the traitor, but for anyone who witnessed it. This wasn't just punishment, it was a form of social programming, ensuring that the mere thought of betrayal would trigger visceral memories of what they had seen. But wait, it gets worse. The Japanese understood something about human nature that we've forgotten in our comfortable modern world. The most effective torture isn't physical. It's watching someone you love suffer because of your choices. Traitors weren't just punished individually. Their families were destroyed, their children sold into slavery, their wives forced to become prostitutes. The betrayer had to watch all of this happen, knowing that every scream, every tear, every moment of degradation was their fault. The samurai class developed what they called inherited guilt. The idea that betrayal was a genetic stain that passed from father to son, mother to daughter, poisoning bloodlines for generations. If your great-grandfather had betrayed his lord, you carried that shame in your DNA. You were watched, suspected, treated as a potential traitor from the moment you drew breath. And here's the part that will make your skin crawl. They made betrayal contagious. If you served alongside a traitor, if you shared rice with them, if you even spoke their name after their betrayal was discovered, you became complicit. The paranoia spread like a virus, turning every friendship into a potential death sentence, every conversation into a gamble with your life. You think you understand fear? Try living in a world where a casual comment about your lord's decisions could be interpreted as treasonous thought, where keeping silent about someone else's doubts made you an accomplice to betrayal, where loyalty wasn't just expected, it was performed, constantly, publicly, with the knowledge that any lapse could trigger the most creative forms of human suffering ever devised. The The Japanese called it the way of the cherry blossom. Beautiful, brief, and destined to fall. But what they didn't tell you was that for traitors, the falling never ended. They created a hell that existed in this world where death was not an escape, but a prolonged journey through every form of humiliation the human mind could conceive. This is what betrayal really meant in feudal Japan. Not a moment of weakness, but a doorway into a carefully constructed nightmare that would make your modern anxieties seem like pleasant dreams. And the most disturbing part? The system worked. It created a society so terrified of betrayal that loyalty became a form of madness, a desperate clinging to honor that drove men to commit acts that would make demons weep. But this story, it didn't end with the Meiji Restoration. The next time you feel that familiar twist of betrayal in your stomach, remember Akechi Mitsuhide and the countless others who learned that in Japan, breaking faith wasn't just a crime, it was an art form. And ask yourself, in a world where loyalty was literally a matter of life and death, what would you have done? Because the truth is, human nature hasn't changed. We've just gotten better at hiding our capacity for betrayal behind screens and social media. The same darkness that drove men to betray their lords in feudal Japan lives inside you right now, waiting for the right moment to emerge. And when it does, you'll understand why the Japanese were so terrified of traitors, because they recognized that we're all capable of becoming one. You thought what I showed you was the worst of it? That was just the opening act. The real horror began when they discovered that killing a traitor quickly was a waste of perfectly good suffering. The Japanese didn't just want justice, they wanted to create a spectacle so terrifying that it would echo through generations, a living reminder that betrayal was worse than death itself. Let me take you deeper into this nightmare. It's 1600, and the Battle of Sekigahara has just reshaped Japan's future. In the aftermath, Tokugawa Ieyasu isn't just hunting down military enemies, he's systematically erasing the concept of betrayal from existence by making examples so horrific that they'd be carved into the collective memory of the nation. But here's what makes this truly disturbing. The Japanese perfected something called social death, the art of destroying someone's existence while keeping their body alive to witness it. They understood that humans are social creatures, and that severing those connections was more devastating than any physical torture. A traitor wasn't just killed, they were unmade, piece by piece, relationship by relationship, until nothing remained but a hollow shell containing screams. You want to know what this looked like? Picture Kobayakawa Hideaki, the man who betrayed the Western Army at Sekigahara. He survived the battle, but his punishment was far worse than death. He was forced to live with the knowledge that everyone he had ever trusted now saw him as a creature without honor, without worth, without the basic humanity that separated man from beast. The process began with what they called the ceremony of names. The traitor was brought before their former comrades, and one by one, each person would speak their name aloud, and then declare that name dead. It sounds simple, almost ritualistic, but imagine the psychological impact. Every friendship, every shared meal, every moment of camaraderie was being publicly annihilated. The traitor had to stand there and watch their entire social existence evaporate. Then came the family destruction. Not just death, that would be merciful. The Japanese created a system where the traitor's family members were forced to participate in their own humiliation. Children were made to renounce their father publicly. Wives were compelled to curse their husband's name. Parents had to declare their own offspring as strangers. The traitor had to witness their loved ones eagerly destroying any connection to them, knowing that this enthusiasm was the only thing keeping their family alive. But here's where it gets truly sick. They made betrayal hereditary. The children of traitors were marked with special symbols, forbidden from certain professions, banned from marrying into honorable family. They created a caste system based on the sins of the father, ensuring that the punishment would continue for generations. The traitor's bloodline became a living monument to their shame. The physical torture was almost an afterthought compared to this psychological annihilation. When they finally got around to destroying the traitor's body, they did it with surgical precision. Each cut was calculated not just for pain, but for symbolic meaning. They would carve symbols into the flesh, marks that told the story of the betrayal, turning the traitor's body into a living text that detailed their crimes. The Japanese had a particular method called the Garden of Shame. The traitor would be buried up to their neck in a public square, with only their head visible above ground. But this wasn't just about exposure, it was about transformation. They would plant flowers around the traitor's head, creating a grotesque garden where the centerpiece was a human being slowly dying of thirst and exposure. People would come to admire the flowers, and children would play nearby, all while the traitor's eyes tracked their movements, unable to speak, unable to move, unable to die. The most disturbing part? The traitor's family was required to tend this garden. They had to water the flowers, trim the grass, maintain the beauty of the space where their loved one was dying. They had to make it beautiful, had to ensure that the traitor's suffering was aesthetically pleasing. It was a form of psychological torture that targeted not just the betrayer, but everyone who had ever cared for them. And if you think this was just about punishment, you're missing the point. This was about social conditioning on a massive scale. The The Japanese understood that humans learn through observation, and they made sure that every aspect of a traitor's destruction was visible, memorable, and absolutely terrifying. Children grew up understanding that betrayal wasn't just wrong. It was a fate, worse than any death imaginable. They even had specialists, artists of suffering who dedicated their lives to perfecting the art of extended death. These weren't just executioners, they were craftsmen who took pride in their work, who saw each traitor as a canvas for their creativity. They would study the betrayer's personality, their relationships, their fears, and then design a punishment that would resonate specifically with that individual's psychological makeup. The records tell us about a man named Ishida Mitsunari, who betrayed his alliance during the Sekigahara camp. His punishment lasted for weeks, and every day brought a new form of degradation. They started by forcing him to eat his own waste, then made him watch as his children were sold to brothels, then slowly removed pieces of his flesh and fed them to dogs while he watched. But the true cruelty was that they kept him conscious and aware throughout the entire process, ensuring that he understood every moment of his destruction. You think you've seen cruelty in your modern world? Your worst bullies? Your most sadistic criminals? Your most twisted minds? They're amateurs compared to what the Japanese created. They turned human suffering into a science, an art form, a social institution that shaped the behavior of entire generations. The psychological scarring wasn't limited to the traitor and their family. The witnesses, the people forced to watch these spectacles, carried the trauma with them for life. They developed what we might recognize today as PTSD, but in feudal Japan, this was considered a feature, not a bug. The system was designed to create a population so traumatized by the mere possibility of betrayal that they would police themselves, turning every citizen into a potential informant. And here's the part that will make you question everything you think you know about human nature. It worked. The Japanese created a society where betrayal was so rare, so unthinkable, that it became almost extinct. They achieved perfect social order through perfect terror, creating a population that was so afraid of betrayal that they couldn't even conceive of it as a possibility. But this perfect order came at a cost that we're still paying today. The trauma of these centuries created cultural patterns that persist in modern Japan: the crushing conformity, the fear of standing out, the desperate need for social approval. The ghosts of feudal betrayal still haunt the Japanese psyche, manifesting in everything from workplace suicide to social isolation. The most chilling part? The Japanese didn't see this as cruel. They saw it as necessary, as the only way to create a stable society. They believed that the capacity for betrayal was a disease that needed to be eradicated, and they were willing to use any means necessary to achieve that goal. This is what happens when loyalty becomes a religion, when the fear of betrayal becomes so overwhelming that it shapes every aspect of human behavior. The Japanese didn't just punish traitors. They created a system that made betrayal psychologically impossible, turning an entire nation into a prison where the guards were the prisoners themselves. But this story, it's not really about medieval Japan, is it? The next time you feel pressured to conform, to stay silent, to avoid rocking the boat, remember the Garden of Shame and ask yourself, what are you so afraid of? Because the truth is, we're all living in the shadow of those feudal fears, still carrying the trauma of a society that chose perfect order over human freedom. And deep down, you know that if you had lived in that time and that place, you would have done exactly what they did. You would have betrayed, or been betrayed, or become complicit in the system that made betrayal impossible. Because that's what humans do. We adapt, we survive, we become whatever we need to become to avoid the Garden of Shame. You think you've seen the depths of human cruelty? We're just getting started. What I've shown you so far was the public face of betrayal's punishment, the spectacle designed to terrify the masses. But behind closed doors in the shadows of feudal Japan, there existed something far more sinister. The architects of agony, men who turned the destruction of traitors into a precise science. Let me introduce you to the Oniwaban, the secret police of the Tokugawa shogunate. You've probably never heard of them, and that's by design. These weren't just spies, they were psychological archaeologists, specialists in excavating the human soul and then systematically destroying it. They understood that true betrayal didn't begin with the act itself. It began with the thought, the doubt, the microscopic crack in loyalty that preceded action. Picture this. It's 1651, and the Keian incident has just been uncovered. A group of Ronin planned to overthrow the Tokugawa government, but before they could act, they were exposed, not by chance, not by accident, but by a network of informants so sophisticated that it could detect betrayal before it even occurred. The Oniwaban didn't just catch traitors. They manufactured them, creating the conditions that would drive loyal men to betray their masters, then punishing them for falling into the trap. Here's what really happened to suspected traitors. They were subjected to something called the breaking of the inner circle. The Oniwaban would infiltrate every aspect of a person's life, their family, their friends, their servants, their lovers. They would plant seeds of doubt, create false evidence, manipulate relationships until the suspected traitor was isolated and paranoid. Then, when the person was most vulnerable, they would offer them a choice: betray someone else or watch everyone you love suffer. The genius of the system was that it created traitors out of loyal men. The Oniwaban understood that most people aren't naturally treacherous. They become traitors through desperation, through fear, through the slow erosion of their moral foundation. So they created the circumstances that would break even the most honorable samurai, then punish them for breaking. But here's where it gets truly disturbing. They kept detailed records. The Oniwaban documented every method they used, every psychological technique, every form of torture that proved effective. They created a library of human suffering, a catalog of cruelty that was passed down through generations. Each new interrogator would study these records, learning from the experiences of their predecessors, refining their techniques until they achieved a level of precision that would make modern psychologists weep. The physical torture was just the beginning. The real art was in the psychological manipulation that preceded it. They would spend weeks, sometimes months, studying a suspected traitor's personality, their relationships, their fears and desires. They would create detailed psychological profiles, mapping out every vulnerability, every pressure point that could be exploited. Then came the isolation. The suspected traitor would be placed in a specially designed cell, not a dungeon, but a replica of their own home, complete with familiar objects and furnishings, but everything would be slightly wrong. The tatami mats would be rotated, the furniture moved just inches from where it should be, the family portraits replaced with images of strangers. The psychological impact was devastating. The comfort of home twisted into a source of constant unease. The interrogators would visit daily, never asking direct questions about betrayal. Instead, they would engage in seemingly casual conversation, discussing the weather, the cherry blossoms, the suspected traitor's family. But every word was calculated, every pause strategic. They were conducting a form of psychological archaeology, carefully excavating the layers of loyalty and doubt that existed in every human mind. They had a technique called the mirror of truth, where they would confront the suspected traitor with evidence of their own thoughts. How did they know what someone was thinking? Through a network of informants so comprehensive that it included the person's own family members. Children were trained to report on their parents, spouses to betray their partners, servants to document every word and gesture of their masters. But the most chilling aspect was the way they used love as a weapon. The Oniwaban understood that the deepest loyalty comes from love, and that the most effective betrayal involves destroying that love. They would force suspected traitors to watch as their children were slowly tortured, their spouses humiliated, their parents degraded. The message was clear: your loyalty to your lord is causing suffering to everyone you care about. The breaking point usually came when the suspected traitor was presented with a choice: betray your lord and save your family, or remain loyal and watch them die. Most chose betrayal, not out of greed or ambition, but out of love. And then, once they had betrayed, they were punished not just for the act of betrayal, but for the weakness that made betrayal possible. The records tell us about a samurai named Yui Shosetsu, one of the leaders of the Keian incident. His interrogation lasted for 6 months, and by the end, he had not only confessed to his own crimes, but had provided detailed information about dozens of other suspected traitors. But here's the sick part. Most of those other traitors were innocent. Yui had been broken so completely that he was willing to invent betrayals just to make the torture stop. The Oniwaban didn't just destroy traitors. They created a culture of suspicion so pervasive that it infected every level of society. Family members turned against each other, friends became informants, love became a luxury that few could afford. They achieved perfect social control by making everyone complicit in the system of betrayal. But the real horror wasn't what they did to traitors. It was what they did to loyalty itself. They turned it into a form of madness, a desperate clinging to honor that drove men to commit acts that betrayed their own humanity. They created a society where the fear of betrayal was so overwhelming that people would betray themselves to avoid being betrayed by others. The psychological techniques they developed were so effective that they influenced every aspect of Japanese culture. The concept of reading the air, the ability to understand unspoken social cues, wasn't just politeness. It was a survival skill developed in response to centuries of psychological surveillance. The Japanese learned to communicate without words because words could be used against them. The most disturbing part? These techniques didn't disappear with the end of feudal Japan. They evolved, adapted, integrated into modern Japanese society in ways that are both subtle and pervasive. The same psychological principles that the Oniwaban used to break traitors now manifest in corporate culture, education systems, social relationships. The Japanese concept of ijime, unbullying, uses many of the same techniques that the Oniwaban employed. Isolation, psychological manipulation, the systematic destruction of social relationships. The children who commit suicide rather than face another day of school bullying, are responding to the same pressures that broke samurai 4 centuries ago. And here's what will make you question everything you think you know about free will. The Oniwaban proved that loyalty isn't a choice. It's a condition that can be manufactured, manipulated, and destroyed. They showed that under the right circumstances, anyone can be turned into a traitor, and that the most loyal people are often the most vulnerable to betrayal. Think about your own life, your own relationships. How many of your loyalties are based on genuine conviction, and how many are simply the result of social conditioning? How many of your friends would you trust with your life, and how many would betray you if the pressure was sufficient? The Oniwaban understood that these questions don't have comfortable answers. They created a system where betrayal was inevitable, where the very act of trying to remain loyal created the conditions that made betrayal necessary. They showed that the line between loyalty and betrayal isn't a moral absolute. It's a psychological construct that can be manipulated by those who understand how the human mind works. The records of the Oniwaban were supposedly destroyed when the Tokugawa shogunate fell, but fragments remain, scattered through archives and private collections. Modern intelligence agencies have studied these fragments, learning from techniques that were perfected centuries ago. The methods may have changed, but the principles remain the same. Isolate, manipulate, break, and then punish the breaking. This is what betrayal really looked like in feudal Japan. Not a moment of weakness, but the inevitable result of a system designed to manufacture traitors. The Oniwaban didn't just punish betrayal, they created it, nurtured it, and then used it to justify their own existence. They turned the human capacity for loyalty into a weapon that could be used against humanity itself. But this story, it's not really about medieval Japan, is it? The next time you feel that familiar pressure to conform, to stay silent, to avoid challenging authority, remember the Oniwaban and ask yourself, are you being loyal or are you being manipulated? Because the truth is, we're all still living in the shadow of those psychological techniques, still vulnerable to the same methods that broke samurai 4 centuries ago. And the most terrifying part? Well, you probably wouldn't even recognize it if it was happening to you, because that's what the Oniwaban perfected. The art of making betrayal feel like choice, of turning victims into willing participants in their own destruction. They showed us that the most effective chains are the ones we forge ourselves in the name of loyalty, honor, and love. You want to know what true horror looks like? It's not the moment of betrayal itself. It's the weeks, months, sometimes years of psychological erosion that leads to that moment. The Japanese understood something about human nature that we've forgotten in our comfortable modern world. We don't break all at once. We crumble piece by piece until there's nothing left but the hollow shell of who we used to be. Let me tell you about the most disturbing case I've ever encountered. Amakusa Shiro, the teenage leader of the Shimabara Rebellion in 1637. You think you know the story? The Christian uprising, the siege, the martyrdom. But what you don't know is what happened to the survivors. The ones who were forced to watch their faith, their families, and their sanity slowly dissolve under the weight of systematic psychological torture. The Shimabara Rebellion wasn't just about religious freedom. It was about the human spirit's capacity to endure suffering. When the rebellion was crushed, the Tokugawa didn't just execute the survivors. They created something far more sinister, a laboratory for studying the breaking point of human loyalty. They wanted to understand exactly how much pressure it takes to turn a martyr into a traitor. Here's what really happened to the captured rebels. They were subjected to something called the gradual eclipse. The torture didn't begin with physical pain, it began with comfort. The prisoners were housed in clean cells, fed regularly, treated with apparent kindness. But every day, something small would change. The food would be slightly less appetizing, the guards slightly less polite, the cell slightly colder. The changes were so subtle that the prisoners couldn't pinpoint when things had gotten worse. They just knew that somehow, gradually, unbearably, they were losing their grip on reality. The psychological impact was devastating. The prisoners began to doubt their own perceptions, their own memories. Had the cell always been this cold? Had the guard always looked at them with such contempt? The uncertainty was more torturous than any physical pain because it attacked the very foundation of their identity, their ability to trust their own senses. But here's where it gets truly sick. They made the prisoners complicit in their own torture. The guards would offer small comforts, an extra blanket, a slightly better meal, in exchange for tiny compromises. Nothing dramatic, just small acts of cooperation that seemed harmless in isolation. Sign this document acknowledging your crimes. Repeat this oath renouncing your beliefs. Provide information about your fellow rebels. Each compromise was presented as reasonable, as the rational choice for someone who wanted to survive. And because the changes were so gradual, so subtle, the prisoners didn't realize they were being transformed. They thought they were being clever, gaming the system, finding ways to survive without truly betraying their principles. But with each small compromise, they were becoming something else, something that could no longer recognize itself. The records tell us about a woman named Maria, one of the Christian rebels captured during the Shimabara siege. She held out for 8 months, maintaining her faith despite constant pressure. But the breakthrough came when her captors brought her a letter, supposedly from her daughter, who had been captured separately. The letter begged Maria to renounce her faith, to save herself, to think of her family rather than her God. The letter was fake, of course. Her daughter had been executed months earlier. But Maria didn't know that. She was faced with what seemed like an impossible choice: maintain her faith and condemn her child to suffering, or betray her beliefs to save her family. She chose betrayal, not out of weakness, but out of love. And then, once she had crossed that line, they showed her the truth, that her daughter was already dead, that her sacrifice had been meaningless. The psychological destruction was complete. Maria hadn't just betrayed her faith, she had betrayed it for nothing. The guilt, the shame, and the crushing realization that she had been manipulated into destroying everything she held sacred broke her mind completely. She spent the remaining years of her life in a kind of living death, unable to speak, unable to pray, unable to remember who she had been before the breaking. But here's the most chilling part. The Japanese didn't see this as cruelty. They saw it as science. They were studying the mechanics of human loyalty, mapping the precise points where faith becomes doubt, where love becomes betrayal, where strength becomes weakness. They created detailed documentation of every technique, every breakthrough, every moment of psychological collapse. The methods they developed were so effective that they influenced every aspect of Japanese society. The concept of nemawashi, the practice of laying groundwork for decisions through informal consensus building, was derived from these torture techniques. The idea is to gradually shift opinion through small, seemingly innocent interactions until the target realizes they've already agreed to something they never intended to support. The Japanese business culture of ringi, collective decision-making through circulating documents, uses the same psychological principles. No one person makes the decision to betray a colleague or abandon a principle. Instead, everyone participates in a gradual process that makes betrayal seem like the natural, inevitable outcome of collective wisdom. But the real horror wasn't what they did to individuals. It was what they did to the concept of resistance itself. They proved that anyone could be broken, that any belief could be undermined, that any loyalty could be transformed into betrayal. They showed that the human spirit isn't an unbreakable force. It's a delicate mechanism that can be dismantled by those who understand how it works. The survivors of these psychological experiments carried the trauma with them for generations. They developed what we might recognize today as complex PTSD, but in feudal Japan, this was seen as a form of spiritual contamination. The broken rebels were shunned by their communities, not out of cruelty, but out of fear that their psychological wounds might be contagious. The most disturbing aspect was how the torture changed the torturers themselves. The guards, the interrogators, the administrators who ran these programs, they began to see human beings as mechanical devices that could be reprogrammed, reformed, remade. They lost the ability to recognize suffering as suffering, seeing it instead as a technical problem to be solved through the application of appropriate pressure. This dehumanization spread throughout Japanese society like a virus. The samurai class, which had once prided itself on honor and compassion, became increasingly mechanical in their approach to human relationships. They began to see loyalty not as a virtue to be cultivated, but as a resource to be exploited. They turned human connection into a tool of control. The psychological techniques developed during the Shimabara aftermath were so effective that they survived the fall of the Tokugawa shogunate. They were adapted by the Meiji government, refined by the military during World War II, and continue to influence Japanese society today. The concept of kaizen, continuous improvement, is based on the same principles of gradual, incremental change that were used to break the Christian rebels. The modern Japanese workplace phenomenon of karoshi, death from overwork, uses the same psychological mechanism. Workers are gradually conditioned to accept increasing levels of stress and responsibility, each change seeming reasonable in isolation until they literally work themselves to death. They become complicit in their own destruction, believing that their sacrifice is necessary, meaningful, honorable. You think you're immune to these techniques? You're not. Every time you've gradually accepted a situation that you once found unacceptable, you've experienced a mild version of the gradual eclipse. Every time you've made a small compromise that led to a larger one, you've walked the same path as the Shimabara rebels. Every time you found yourself doing something you never thought you would do, you've discovered the same truth that they did. We're all more fragile than we think. The Japanese proved that betrayal isn't a single moment of weakness. It's the end result of a process that begins with comfort and ends with complicity. They showed that the most effective way to destroy someone isn't to attack their beliefs directly, but to gradually erode the foundation upon which those beliefs rest. They demonstrated that we don't choose to betray. We're led to betrayal through a series of small, seemingly reasonable steps. Here's what will make you question everything you think you know about your own moral strength. The techniques that broke the Shimabara rebels are still being used today. They've been refined, modernized, adapted to contemporary circumstances, but the core principles remain the same. The gradual eclipse is happening all around you, in your workplace, your relationships, your political system. The most frightening part? You probably wouldn't recognize it if it was happening to you, because that's what the Japanese perfected. The art of making destruction feel like progress, of turning victims into willing participants in their own betrayal. They showed us that the human capacity for self-deception is infinite, and that the most effective chains are the ones we forge ourselves, one small compromise at a time. Think about your own life. How many small compromises have you made? How many times have you told yourself that this one exception wouldn't matter, that you could maintain your principles while making small adjustments to reality? How many times have you found yourself in a position you never intended to occupy, wondering how you got there? The truth is, we're all living in the shadow of the Shimabara experiments. We're all vulnerable to the same techniques that broke those rebels 4 centuries ago. And the most terrifying part? We probably wouldn't even fight back, because we wouldn't recognize the attack until it was too late. But this story, it's not really about medieval Japan, is it? The next time you feel that familiar pressure to make a small compromise, to accept a slightly unacceptable situation, to take one step down a path you know you shouldn't walk, remember Maria and the gradual eclipse? Because the truth is, we're all just one small compromise away from becoming something we never intended to be. And deep down, you know that's true. You know that your moral strength isn't as unbreakable as you think, that your principles aren't as solid as you believe, that your loyalty isn't as unwavering as you hope. Because that's what the Japanese showed us, that we're all capable of betrayal if the pressure is applied correctly, gradually, lovingly, until we don't even recognize what we've become. You think this is all ancient history? That these horrors died with the samurai and their feudal lords? Let me shatter that comfortable illusion. The techniques perfected in feudal Japan didn't disappear. They evolved, adapted, and integrated so seamlessly into modern society that you're living under their influence right now and you don't even know it. The most chilling realization isn't what the Japanese did to traitors 4 centuries ago. It's what they're still doing today. The psychological mechanisms that broke samurai warriors are now embedded in corporate culture, education systems, social media algorithms, and political structures worldwide. The virus of systematic betrayal has spread far beyond Japan's borders, mutating and adapting to contemporary circumstances. Let me show you something that will make your blood run cold: the Japanese concept of salaryman suicide. Every year, thousands of Japanese office workers kill themselves, driven to despair by workplace conditions that would have been familiar to the Oniwaban. They're subjected to the same gradual eclipse, the same incremental compromises, the same systematic erosion of personal identity that broke the Shimabara rebels. The process begins with something called power harassment, a sanitized term for psychological torture that would make feudal interrogators proud. New employees are gradually conditioned to accept increasingly unreasonable demands, each request seeming barely beyond the previous one. Work 16 hours a day, skip meals, abandon family obligations, sleep at your desk. The progression is so subtle that victims don't realize they're being destroyed until it's too late. But here's what makes this truly sinister. The companies don't see this as cruelty. They see it as character building, as the natural process of creating loyal employees. They've convinced themselves and their victims that this systematic degradation is actually a form of love, a way of helping people reach their full potential. The same psychological manipulation that the Oniwaban used to justify their torture chamber. The suicide rate among Japanese salarymen isn't a bug in the system. It's a feature. It serves the same function that public executions served in feudal Japan. It terrorizes the survivors into compliance. Every worker who jumps from an office building sends a message to their colleagues. This is what happens when you can't handle the pressure. This is what weakness looks like. And the most disturbing part? The families of suicide victims often apologize to the companies that killed their loved ones. They've been so thoroughly conditioned to accept the system that they see the death as a personal failure rather than institutional murder. They carry the shame of their relatives' weakness, just as the families of executed traitors carried the shame of betrayal. But Japan is just the laboratory where these techniques were perfected. They've spread to every corner of the globe, adapting to local cultures while maintaining their core psychological principles. The American concept of grind culture uses the same gradual eclipse methodology. Young entrepreneurs are conditioned to sacrifice everything: health, relationships, sanity, for the promise of success. They're taught that sleep is weakness, that boundaries are failure, that self-care is selfishness. The tech industry has weaponized these techniques with surgical precision. Social media platforms use psychological manipulation that would make the Oniwaban weep with admiration. They've created systems that gradually erode your sense of self, your ability to think independently, your capacity for genuine human connection. Every notification, every like, every algorithmic recommendation is designed to make you slightly more compliant, slightly more dependent, slightly more willing to betray your own interests. You think you're making choices about what to consume, what to believe, how to live? You're not. You're being guided through a carefully constructed maze of psychological triggers, each one designed to make the next compromise seem reasonable. The same incremental manipulation that broke Christian rebels in 1637 is now being used to break your will to resist corporate surveillance, political manipulation, and social control. The educational system uses these techniques to create compliant citizens who don't question authority. Students are gradually conditioned to accept increasingly unreasonable demands, to sacrifice their mental health for grades, to compete against each other instead of supporting each other. They're taught that conformity is wisdom, that questioning is dangerous, that individual thought is selfish. The political system has embraced these methods with enthusiasm. Politicians don't try to convince you to support policies you disagree with. They gradually shift your perception of what's acceptable, what's normal, what's inevitable. They use the same psychological techniques that turned loyal samurai into traitors, making you complicit in your own oppression while convinced you're exercising free will. Here's what will make you question everything you think you know about your own autonomy. The techniques that broke feudal Japanese rebels are now being used to break you. Every day, in countless small ways, you're being conditioned to accept things you once found unacceptable. Every compromise you make, every boundary you allow to be crossed, every principle you abandon for convenience, you're walking the same path as Maria, as Yui Shosetsu, as countless others who thought they were stronger than the system. The most frightening example is how these techniques have been applied to entire populations during times of crisis. The response to global pandemics, economic collapses, and social upheavals follows the same pattern that feudal Japan used to break rebellious communities. First, create fear. Then, offer protection in exchange for small sacrifices of freedom. Gradually increase the demands while maintaining the illusion of choice. Make compliance seem like civic duty, resistance like selfishness. The genius of the system is that it makes you feel like you're making rational choices. You're not being coerced. You're being reasonable. You're not being manipulated. You're being responsible. You're not being broken. You're being improved. The same psychological sleight of hand that made traitors believe they were protecting their families while destroying their honor. Modern corporations have perfected the art of making exploitation feel like opportunity. They use the same gradual eclipse techniques to convince workers that unpaid overtime is career advancement, that constant availability is professionalism, that sacrificing personal life is dedication. They've created a culture where being exploited is seen as a privilege, where burnout is a badge of honor, where self-destruction is mistaken for self-improvement. The healthcare system uses these techniques to make patients complicit in their own suffering. Gradual cost increases, reduced services, longer wait times. Each change presented as necessary, reasonable, inevitable. Patients are conditioned to accept lower quality care while paying higher prices, to blame themselves for their inability to afford treatment, to view their suffering as a personal failing rather than a systemic problem. But here's what makes this truly terrifying. The people implementing these systems don't see themselves as torturers. They see themselves as helpers, as leaders, as necessary components of a functioning society. They've been subjected to the same psychological conditioning that they're now inflicting on others. They're victims who have become perpetrators, broken people who are breaking others, traitors who are creating more traitors. The most disturbing aspect is how these techniques have been applied to intimate relationships. The same psychological manipulation that the Oniwaban used to break family bonds is now being used to control romantic partners, to manipulate children, to dominate friendships. Emotional abuse follows the same pattern of gradual escalation, incremental boundary violations, and systematic erosion of self-worth. The digital age has made these techniques more powerful than ever. Your phone, your computer, your smart TV, they're all equipped with sensors and algorithms designed to monitor your behavior, predict your responses, and gradually modify your thoughts and actions. You're being subjected to psychological manipulation that operates below the threshold of conscious awareness, changing your brain chemistry in ways that make you more compliant, more predictable, more exploitable. The most chilling realization is that resistance itself has been weaponized. The same techniques that created traitors in feudal Japan are now being used to create controlled opposition, to channel dissent in directions that serve the system's interests. Every protest, every movement, every act of rebellion is monitored, analyzed, and ultimately co-opted by forces that understand how to turn resistance into compliance. You think you're fighting the system? You're not. You're being allowed to fight in ways that don't threaten the system's core functions. You're being given the illusion of rebellion while being guided toward outcomes that serve the interests of those in power. The same psychological manipulation that made samurai think they were choosing honor while actually choosing betrayal. The ultimate horror isn't that these techniques exist, it's that they work. They work because they exploit fundamental aspects of human psychology that haven't changed in centuries. They work because they make exploitation feel like choice, suffering feel like growth, betrayal feel like loyalty. They work because they turn victims into willing participants in their own destruction. And the most terrifying part? You're probably already broken. You've already been subjected to these techniques for so long that you can't remember what it felt like to be unmanipulated, uncontrolled, genuinely free. You've been gradually conditioned to accept a level of psychological oppression that would have driven feudal peasants to rebellion, and you call it normal life. The techniques that broke samurai warriors are breaking you right now. The only difference is that you don't realize it's happening. You think you're living in a free society, making independent choices, pursuing your own goals, but every decision you make, every thought you think, every emotion you feel, has been shaped by psychological manipulation techniques that were perfected in the torture chambers of feudal Japan. This isn't ancient history, it's your daily reality. The ghosts of betrayed samurai are whispering in your ear every time you compromise your principles for convenience, every time you sacrifice your well-being for approval, every time you betray your own interests, while convincing yourself you're being reasonable. But this story, it's not really about historical techniques, is it? The next time you feel that familiar pressure to go along with something you know is wrong, to accept something you know is unacceptable, to compromise something you know is important, remember that you're not just making a personal choice. You're participating in a system of psychological manipulation that has been refined for centuries, and you're becoming exactly what that system wants you to become. And deep down, you know that's already happened. You know that you're already living in the shadow of techniques that were designed to break human will, that you're already more broken than you want to admit, that you're already complicit in your own psychological enslavement. Because that's what the Japanese legacy really is. Not the historical horror of feudal betrayal, but the contemporary reality of a world where everyone is both victim and perpetrator, where everyone is breaking while helping to break others, where everyone is betraying while being betrayed. You think you understand betrayal? You felt the cold knife twist in your stomach when someone you trusted turned against you. But let me tell you something that will make your modern heartbreak seem like a gentle caress. In feudal Japan, betrayal wasn't just personal, it was an art form painted in blood, and the canvas was human flesh. Tonight, while you scroll through your phone, safe in your comfortable ignorance, I'm going to show you what it really meant to be branded a traitor in a land where honor was sharper than any blade. And when I'm done, you'll never look at loyalty the same way again. Because deep down, in that primitive corner of your brain that still remembers ancient fears, you'll recognize the same capacity for betrayal that lives inside you right now. Picture this. It's 1467, and the Onin War has just begun. Japan is tearing itself apart. And in this chaos, every samurai faces a choice that will define not just their death, but how their family will remember them for generations. The air smells of cherry blossoms and burning villages. A contradiction that would make you laugh if you weren't busy trying to survive. But here's what your history books never told you. Betrayal in feudal Japan wasn't a moment of weakness. It was a calculated dance with death, where every step was choreographed by centuries of ritual, honor, and the most creative forms of human suffering ever devised. The Japanese didn't just kill traitors. They erased them from existence in ways that would make your worst nightmares seem like bedtime stories. You see, the concept of loyalty, giri, wasn't just a social expectation. It was a living, breathing entity that demanded blood sacrifice. When you swore fealty to your daimyo, you weren't just promising to serve. You were signing a contract written in your own potential agony, agreeing that if you ever broke that bond, your death would serve as entertainment for others. Let me introduce you to someone who learned this lesson the hard way. Akechi Mitsuhide, the man who betrayed Oda Nobunaga in 1582. You might think you know this story, the ambitious retainer who turned against his lord at Honnoji Temple. But what you don't know is what happened to traitors who weren't lucky enough to die quickly in battle. Mitsuhide was fortunate. He died fighting, sword in hand, before the real punishment could begin. Others weren't so blessed. When a samurai was caught alive after betraying his lord, the process of dying began long before the final breath left their body. The Japanese had perfected the art of extended death, not just physical, but spiritual annihilation that reached backward through time to stain every ancestor, and forward to curse every descendant. The first stage of a traitor's death was isolation. They were stripped of their name, their family crest, their very identity. In a culture where your name was your soul, this was like being flayed alive from the inside out. Imagine waking up one morning and discovering that every photo of you had been erased, every record of your existence deleted, every person you'd ever known forbidden to speak your name. That's what happened to traitors. They became unpersons, ghosts walking among the living. But the psychological torture was just the appetizer. The main course was something called death by 1,000 cuts. Though the Japanese had their own variations that would make Chinese lingxi seem merciful, the key wasn't just to cause pain. Any amateur could do that. The art was in calibrating the suffering to match the magnitude of the betrayal, creating a symphony of agony that would resonate through generations. They would start with the fingers, not cutting them off. That would be too quick, too kind. Instead, they would slowly peel away the nail, then the skin, then work their way down to the bone, all while keeping the traitor conscious and aware. The smell of blood and fear would fill the air, mixing with the incense that was always burning in Japanese courtyards, creating a scent that witnesses would carry with them for the rest of their lives. Here's what really happened to betrayers. They were forced to watch their own dismantling. Mirrors were positioned so they could see every cut, every drop of blood, every moment of their own destruction. The psychological impact was devastating, not just for the traitor, but for anyone who witnessed it. This wasn't just punishment, it was a form of social programming, ensuring that the mere thought of betrayal would trigger visceral memories of what they had seen. But wait, it gets worse. The Japanese understood something about human nature that we've forgotten in our comfortable modern world. The most effective torture isn't physical. It's watching someone you love suffer because of your choices. Traitors weren't just punished individually. Their families were destroyed, their children sold into slavery, their wives forced to become prostitutes. The betrayer had to watch all of this happen, knowing that every scream, every tear, every moment of degradation was their fault. The samurai class developed what they called inherited guilt. The idea that betrayal was a genetic stain that passed from father to son, mother to daughter, poisoning bloodlines for generations. If your great-grandfather had betrayed his lord, you carried that shame in your DNA. You were watched, suspected, treated as a potential traitor from the moment you drew breath. And here's the part that will make your skin crawl. They made betrayal contagious. If you served alongside a traitor, if you shared rice with them, if you even spoke their name after their betrayal was discovered, you became complicit. The paranoia spread like a virus, turning every friendship into a potential death sentence, every conversation into a gamble with your life. You think you understand fear? Try living in a world where a casual comment about your lord's decisions could be interpreted as treasonous thought. Where keeping silent about someone else's doubts made you an accomplice to betrayal. Where loyalty wasn't just expected, it was performed, constantly, publicly, with the knowledge that any lapse could trigger the most creative forms of human suffering ever devised. The Japanese called it the way of the cherry blossom. Beautiful, brief, and destined to fall. But what they didn't tell you was that for traitors, the falling never ended. They created a hell that existed in this world, where death was not an escape, but a prolonged journey through every form of humiliation the human mind could conceive. This is what betrayal really meant in feudal Japan. Not a moment of weakness, but a doorway into a carefully constructed nightmare that would make your modern anxieties seem like pleasant dreams. And the most disturbing part? The system worked. It created a society so terrified of betrayal that loyalty became a form of madness, a desperate clinging to honor that drove men to commit acts that would make demons weep. But this story, it didn't end with the Meiji Restoration. The next time you feel that familiar twist of betrayal in your stomach, remember Akechi Mitsuhide and the countless others who learned that in Japan, breaking faith wasn't just a crime, it was an art form. And ask yourself, in a world where loyalty was literally a matter of life and death, what would you have done? Because the truth is, human nature hasn't changed. We've just gotten better at hiding our capacity for betrayal behind screens and social media. The same darkness that drove men to betray their lords in feudal Japan lives inside you right now, waiting for the right moment to emerge. And when it does, you'll understand why the Japanese were so terrified of traitors, because they recognize that we're all capable of becoming one. You've made it this far. You've read about the horrors, the manipulation, the techniques that turned human beings into ghosts of themselves. You've seen how the Japanese feudal system didn't just punish treason, it cultivated it, nurtured it, transformed it into a tool of social control, so effective it still haunts us today. But now comes the question you've been avoiding. What are you going to do with this information? Because here's the most disturbing truth of all. Knowing these mechanisms doesn't make you immune. In fact, it may make you even more vulnerable. When you understand how manipulation works, you might start to believe you're above it, that your awareness is armor against these ancient techniques. But that confidence is exactly what the masters of manipulation want you to feel. Let me tell you the last secret of Japan's architects of agony. They discovered that the most dangerous people to the system weren't the ignorant, they were the enlightened. Those who understood how betrayal worked, how loyalty was manufactured, how honor was weaponized. They were the ones who needed to be broken completely, subtly, devastatingly. There's a lost document, fragments of a manuscript supposedly written by a former Oniwaban member at the end of the Edo period. It describes something called the final betrayal. Not a vassal's betrayal of his lord, but a person's betrayal of their own perception of reality. The manuscript suggests that the ultimate goal of the system wasn't to create loyal subjects, but people who believed they were free while being completely controlled. Think about it. How many times have you said, "At least I know this is happening"? How many times have you comforted yourself with the idea that simply being aware of a problem was enough? How many times have you felt superior for understanding something others didn't? That feeling of being woke while others sleep? It's a form of control in itself. The manuscript describes rituals where confessed traitors were brought before new prisoners as examples. But here's the trick. The traitors were actually system agents, trained actors playing the part of broken men. They tell tales of how they were deceived, manipulated, how they realized too late they were under control. The prisoners left those sessions believing they now understood the system, believing they were immune. Of course, that made them even more vulnerable, because once you think you know how manipulation works, you stop looking for it. You become complacent, confident, arrogant, and that's when the most sophisticated techniques are applied, not against your ignorance, but against your so-called wisdom. The scariest truth about this legacy isn't that these techniques still exist. It's that they evolved into something subtler, stronger. They don't need to break you openly anymore. They can make you believe you chose your own downfall, that you're participating willingly because you think you understand the game. Do you think you're resisting by posting critiques online, voting for anti-establishment candidates, buying products from ethical companies? All of these are forms of resistance that were anticipated, calculated, absorbed by the system. You're being allowed to resist in ways that pose no real threat, while believing you're making a difference. The fragmented manuscript describes something called the Garden of Conscious Illusion, a psychological torture method where the prisoner was placed in a beautiful Zen-like garden cell. They had books to read, decent food, even writing materials. They felt privileged, special, different from others in regular cells, but it was all an illusion. The books were carefully selected to shape their thinking. The food subtly altered mood and cognition. Their writings were monitored, used to map their psyche with a precision modern data analysis could barely match. What's most disturbing is that prisoners in this garden often became advocates for the system. They truly believed they were being treated with humanity, that their captors valued culture and education. They felt grateful for their privileged status, forgetting they were still prisoners. Sound familiar? How many times have you felt lucky to have a job that only moderately exploits you? Grateful to live in a system that offers limited freedoms? How often have you defended a system you know is unjust, simply because you believe you understand how to navigate it? The most advanced modern technique is making you believe you're an informed, conscious participant, not a victim, making you feel in control of your own exploitation, making you believe that understanding the system equals freedom from it. This is the final evolution of techniques the Japanese began perfecting centuries ago. But here's what the manuscript doesn't say. What I discovered for myself: there is a way out. It's not easy, not comfortable, and certainly not safe. But it's possible. The key isn't resisting the system from the outside. It's recognizing how it already operates within you. It's not enough to know how others are manipulated. You must confront how you are manipulated. This means questioning not only what you know is wrong, but what you're sure is right. Examining not just your oppositions, but your loyalties. Realizing that reading this, being awake to these truths, might itself be part of the control system. The real question isn't, how can I avoid manipulation? It's, how can I live authentically in a world where manipulation is omnipresent? And the answer isn't to escape the system, but to develop a conscious relationship with it, to recognize you're being influenced, accept you'll never be completely free, and choose how you'll respond. The samurai who kept their sanity in Japan's darkest times weren't those who denied manipulation. They accepted it as part of the human condition, but chose their responses with deliberate awareness. They knew real courage wasn't fearlessness, it was conscious action despite fear. The same principle applies now. You can't fully escape the manipulation woven into society, but you can cultivate awareness to recognize it in real time. You can build inner strength to make conscious choices even under pressure. You can learn to distinguish your authentic voice from the system's planted whispers. This isn't a one-time cure. It's a daily moment-to-moment discipline of conscious vigilance, like learning to meditate on a battlefield. You can never fully let your guard down, but you can stay centered amidst the chaos. And here's the final irony. The pursuit of total awakening can itself become another trap. The obsession with being completely free can make you even more vulnerable. The true masters of resistance aren't those who claim to have all the answers, but those humbly aware of their own limits and vulnerabilities. So what will you do now? Close this document and pretend you never read it? Become paranoid, seeing manipulation in every interaction? Or will you find a third way? The way of compassionate awareness, recognizing manipulation without letting it consume you. The choice is yours. But remember, whatever choice you make will be influenced by the same forces that shaped Japan's traitors and loyalists. The difference is that now you know it. And maybe, just maybe, that awareness is the first real step towards something resembling freedom. Because in the end, the real betrayal isn't breaking loyalty to others. It's betraying yourself, letting outside forces define who you are, what you believe, how you live. And true loyalty isn't blind obedience to any system or leader. It's the courage to stay true to your conscience, even at the cost of disapproval, rejection, or worse. The ghosts of Japan's traitors aren't whispering for you to betray others. They're whispering for you to wake up to the betrayals you've already committed against yourself. And maybe, if you're brave enough to listen, you can start walking a different path. But beware, even that choice might be part of the system. Even that awareness could be manufactured. Even that freedom may be an illusion. The labyrinth of manipulation has no clear exit. Only the possibility of walking it with your eyes wide open. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough.